March 26, 2024. At 12:39 that morning, the shipping container vessel MV Dolly got underway from the port of Baltimore Seagirt Terminal. Her final destination was Colombo, Sri Lanka, a voyage that, because of conflict in the Middle East, now takes 26 days. On board the vessel, she got underway with 21 crew members and 2 harbor pilots. Harbor pilots are extremely experienced mariners whose job is to assist ships coming into and out of port. Their intimate knowledge of the port and its environment is critical to safe navigation. Often, their use is compulsory for all ships over a certain tonnage entering and exiting port. Also on board the Dolly that night were just over 4,700 shipping containers full of goods, including 56 containers with hazardous materials like lithium batteries, corrosive chemicals, and flammable substances. As the giant merchant got underway, she was assisted by several tugs. Per normal procedures, the tugs cast off and returned to port once the vessel got safely into the channel outside the port. Once inside the channel, the Dolly had nowhere to go except forward. With a length of 980 feet, a width of over 150 feet, and a draft of over 40 feet, the Dolly was too large to turn around in a narrow channel that was only 700 feet wide and 50 feet deep. Instead, if anything happened, she had to keep going forward, and unfortunately, misfortune did strike. At 1:24 a.m., the Dolly was underway in the channel at 8 knots. Just a minute later, numerous alarms sounded and the vessel lost power. A minute later, at 1:26 a.m., the vessel regained power. However, due to the loss of power and the dangerous situation the ship was already in, one of the pilots radioed back to port for the tugs to come back and assist the Dolly. At the same time the pilot was talking to the tugs, another pilot contacted the emergency dispatch line at the Pilot Dispatch Agency to begin efforts on closing down traffic to the bridge. However, despite their efforts, the Dolly was still creeping forward, and with only about 90 seconds until impact and no tugs in sight, the pilots ordered the captain to let go of the anchor in a last-ditch effort to stop the vessel. However, just after giving this order, the Dolly lost power again. By this time, the ship had made another mayday call, warning everyone in the area what was happening. Police officers stationed on either side of the bridge, who were already controlling traffic flow for ongoing construction work on the bridge, quickly mobilized to shut down traffic. As officers on either end of the bridge closed all lanes, video evidence shows that several vehicles traveling on the bridge escaped with just seconds to spare. This is because at 1:29 a.m., just 5 minutes after the initial loss of power, the Dolly struck the right main support truss of the bridge. Within seconds, the 366-meter bridge, the third longest in the world of its kind, collapsed into the frigid Patapsco River. Numerous 911 calls about the bridge were coming in by 1:30 a.m., and by 1:35 a.m., Maryland State Police, Baltimore City Police, and the U.S. Coast Guard were all en route to the scene. But for some, it was already too late. But how did the bridge fall so quickly? Despite the amazing engineering that went into the bridge, there was probably little anyone could have done against a ship strike as massive as the Dolly. First opened for public use in 1977, the Francis Scott Key Bridge was completed just a few years before the 1980 Sunshine Skyway Bridge disaster in Florida. Due to problems with that bridge's construction, it was mandated that all future bridges have mechanisms in place, like extra barriers and redundancies, to reduce the impact of a large ship strike. But even these measures might not have been enough. Though it was true that the Francis Scott Key Bridge was grandfathered into the new regulations without having to make modifications, some media reports that no upgrades were made and are inaccurate. Preliminary evidence shows the bridge passed numerous safety inspections as recently as 2019, and that there were some barriers around the support trusses designed to prevent a catastrophic collapse, as we saw happen in the video. However, one study by the New York Times shows that it was likely impossible for any bridge to have withstood the massive forces at play that night. Based on publicly available data and the ship's cargo, the New York Times reasonably concluded that the force of the Dolly hitting the bridge that night was over 100 million newtons of force. By comparison, the Saturn V rocket, the largest rocket ever used by NASA, had a launch force of around 35 million newtons. That means at the moment of collision, it was like the Francis Scott Key Bridge got hit by 3 Saturn V rockets at the same time. With such a massive force on such a critical point, is it no wonder why the bridge failed as dramatically as it did? Though now we have a much better understanding of what happened, what has been the government's response since the accident? At the time of the impact, there was a road crew performing routine work on the bridge. 8 construction workers fell into the water that night. 2 were rescued immediately, 1 with serious injuries, and 1 who miraculously walked away without a scratch. However, as of the making of this video, 3 of the workers' bodies have been found, with 3 others who are missing but presumed dead. Local, state, and federal authorities began a massive search and rescue effort within minutes of the collision. This massive response effort included 8 teams of 50 divers whose job was to rescue anyone trapped in the rubble below. But there was a problem. With the water temperature that night at 47 degrees, even if someone was alive in the water, there was not much time to rescue them. Additionally, with visibility conditions underwater in that part of the river at near zero, it was an incredibly dangerous and tough environment to work in. With the rescue operation now turned into a recovery operation, the mission to bring home all the men to their families has been partially successful. But what about cleaning up the debris from the accident? With the main channel into Baltimore Harbor shut down, the economic impact has been huge. Before the Allison, the Port of Baltimore was in the top 20 ports in the U.S., but ranked number 1 for automobile imports and coal exports. Because of this, more than 15,000 people worked directly in the port, and more than 10 times that number indirectly supported these workers' jobs. Because the bridge's loss is costing the economy more than $15 million a day in lost revenue, authorities have been under intense pressure to reopen the channel as soon as possible. But there is a problem. Removing debris from the channel safely is more involved than people might think. Due to the jagged, twisted metal and concrete and practically zero visibility, removing bridge remains is slow and dangerous work. This is because, as each area of the channel to be excavated is prepped for work, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers must first conduct an underwater survey. Then, once workers know where the debris field is, specialized barge cranes can then lift the debris up. Once completed, authorities must complete another survey to understand how the debris field shifted so as not to endanger divers or any of the more than 3 dozen barges, recovery vessels, tugboats, and Coast Guard ships cleaning up the bridge. But despite the slow going of the full cleanup efforts, teams have already made significant progress. As of the making of this video, 2 auxiliary channels have already been opened. The second, much larger one is about 10 feet deep and almost 270 feet across. However, it should be noted that these auxiliary channels are not meant for large merchant ships like the Dolly to enter and leave port. Instead, they're designed for the movement of recovery vessels and barges and to let some smaller ships and barges that have been trapped inside the Port of Baltimore since the accident finally leave. Of course, all these efforts are incredibly expensive. So who will fit the bill for this disaster? Current estimates vary wildly, but the general consensus is that the total construction costs and civil damages will be between $2 to $4 billion. If correct, it would be the most expensive maritime disaster in human history. But who would be on the hook for such a massive bill? At the time of the accident, the MV Dolly was owned by a Japanese company called Grace Ocean and managed by a Singaporean company called Synergy Marine Group. While one might think these 2 companies would be the ones footing the whole bill, that would only be partially correct. Though both the owner and management company are liable for damages, they're not the only ones. The insurance company that wrote the Dolly's policies was Britannia, a part of the umbrella group of insurers called the International Group of P&I Clubs. This group writes about 90% of all the insurance policies for marine traffic in the world. But for how much would each entity be liable? According to an obscure 1851 U.S. law, Ocean Grace and Synergy Marine Group might be protected by limiting their total liability to the cost of the vessel minus repair and salvage costs. Before the collision, the Dolly was estimated to be worth around $90 million. According to documents filed in federal court, The vessel would be worth around $40 million when subtracting repair and salvage costs. As for Britannia, the insurer has a payout limit of $100 million on civil damages. And if you're doing the math, at around $140 million, that is just a fraction of the total cost to rebuild the bridge. So where is the rest coming from? As with any major disaster, whether it be hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, or, in this case, a bridge collapse, insurance companies carry insurance policies on each other to help make massive payouts. This is known as reinsurance, and it is a way that insurance companies of all types protect themselves from catastrophic losses. The way it works is that, basically, every insurance company takes policies out on one another. These policies are then put in offshore banks like in the Caribbean. In a catastrophic disaster like this, those companies that participate in the pool each pay a certain percentage of the damages to protect one another. With a global reinsurance industry worth about $670 billion, a $3 billion loss is just a drop in the bucket for these companies. However, getting this money is going to take a lot of time. Between two different owners, dozens of reinsurance companies, and most undoubtedly wrongful death lawsuits, the litigation for this case will take years to play out. In the meantime, President Biden has urged Congress to pass emergency funding to pay for all reconstruction efforts while court cases continue. As of the making of this video, Congress has yet to pass any spending bills for reconstruction efforts. However, the Federal Highway Administration has already approved more than $60 million in emergency funding to pay for immediate salvage and cleanup efforts. Additionally, the Maryland State Legislature is likely to approve measures that will provide immediate economic relief for workers and businesses impacted by the disaster and help temporarily relocate impacted businesses outside of Baltimore so they do not shut down. But despite what seems like good progress on at least partial funding, how long will it take to clear the channel and rebuild the bridge? According to the most recent Army Corps of Engineers estimates, the plan is to have the channel completely cleared of debris by the end of May of this year. As for the bridge itself, it will likely take years to open a new one for public use. In the meantime, authorities have been diverting traffic to the two main tunnels that run further north in the heart of Baltimore. However, large trucks and those carrying hazardous materials are still impacted. Exactly when Baltimore will return to normal for all shipping, vehicle, and transportation needs is unknown. The only hope is that Congress can put aside their partisan beliefs for the good of the country and pass funding to soon get Baltimore back on track as soon as possible. Bye for now.